After months and months of speculating who the 4 teams would be in the college football playoff, we almost have our answer. With the college football season wrapped up and conference championships next weekend, we pretty much know who the 4 teams are going to be in the college football playoff. Well, at this point, it looks like we know 3 of them. The 4th spot is likely going to be USC, but depending on what happens in their game, the 4th and final spot of the college football playoff is still up for grabs. Before we get to today's video, make sure to smash that subscribe button and turn on those notifications if you're new to my channel. If you're watching this video, odds are that you love college football, and odds are you aren't subscribed to my channel. So make sure to subscribe to one of the best college football communities here on YouTube. I'm posting college football videos every day all season, so make sure to subscribe so you never miss a video. Also, don't forget to drop a like on this video as well. It helps out with that YouTube algorithm and helps share the video with more college football fans. Plus, it only takes a second to do. Before we get to who I think the 4 teams are going to be in the college football playoff, let's take a look at the teams that were eliminated from contention this weekend. Now, the first team was probably the most shocking, as I still thought they had a strong chance of reaching the playoff. LSU is going to be in the SEC championship game next weekend. Although they're not likely to beat Georgia, I've been saying for weeks that if they were somehow able to knock off the Bulldogs, the Tigers would be the first 2-loss team to reach the college football playoff. Now, LSU can certainly beat Georgia next weekend, nothing has changed in regards to that. But if they're able to beat Georgia, they're not going to be in the college football playoff. And that's because they lost this weekend to Texas A&M. Yep, that's right. LSU, who's been one of the hottest teams in all of college football for the past month, closed their season by losing by 15 points to Texas A&M. Now, this was still a close game midway through the 3rd quarter, as things were actually tied at 17. But Texas A&M went on a 21-0 run that ultimately put the game out of reach and knocked LSU out of playoff contention. So with LSU out of the running, it makes next week's matchup that much easier if LSU were to somehow win. Another team that got eliminated was Clemson, who lost by 1 point at home to South Carolina. Entering the game, Clemson was a 14-point favorite, and they actually jumped out to a 14-0 lead in the 1st quarter. South Carolina was able to chip into their deficit, but Clemson still had a 9-point lead entering the half. The Gamecocks were able to outscore Clemson 17-7 in the 2nd half and escape with the 1-point victory. Although Clemson only had 1 loss entering this game, they didn't have high chances of reaching the college football playoff. But if there would have been chaos in front of them and they would have won this weekend and next weekend in the ACC title game, the Tigers likely would have found themselves as the 4th and final team of the playoff. But by losing to South Carolina, they're completely wiped out of playoff contention. So even though there were still a lot of teams in the hunt, Clemson and LSU, by losing, completely wiped themselves out and made things that much easier for next weekend's rankings. So with those 2 teams out of the mix, who is still alive in the college football playoff discussion? Like I mentioned at the beginning of the video, I think there are 3 teams that have guaranteed their spot in the playoff regardless of what happens next weekend in the conference championship games. Georgia is 12-0 and they face LSU, and regardless of what happens in that game, I think Georgia's in with a win or a loss. Michigan is coming off a 22-point victory on the road at Ohio State. They're going to face Purdue in the Big Ten title game, and I also think regardless of what happens, they're in with a win or a loss. The interesting team that a lot of people are talking about is TCU, who enters next weekend 12-0, and they're likely going to be ranked 3rd in the country. They're going to face a solid Kansas State team, who likely is going to be ranked inside the top 10 next weekend. A lot of people think that if TCU loses, they should fall out of the playoff discussion, but I just don't get that at all. If they somehow lose next weekend, they're going to be 12-1 on the season, and they're going to be one of a handful of teams that played in their conference title game. Plus, it's not like they're losing to a completely irrelevant team. They'd be losing to a top 10 Kansas State team. So regardless of what happens, whether or not they win or lose, I believe TCU deserves to be one of the final teams in the college football playoff. So with those 3 spots guaranteed, that leaves 1 available spot for a few teams to battle it out for. Now, things could get really easy based on just 1 result. If USC is able to beat Utah, they're the 4th and final team in, and that shouldn't even be a discussion. So if that happens, your 4 teams are Georgia, Michigan, TCU, and USC, but I'm sure those teams might be flipped in the rankings just a little based on what happens in the games. I expect USC to beat Utah, as they should have beaten them the first time around, but Utah decided to go for 2 in the final minute, and it helped them pull off the upset. But let's say USC somehow loses to Utah next weekend. One of those teams is likely going to be Ohio State, who I did a video video on yesterday saying they shouldn't even sniff the college football playoff at all. If you'd like to hear my in-depth thoughts on why I think the Buckeyes shouldn't be a playoff team, go and watch yesterday's video, because I'm not going to go too in-depth on that today. But if USC loses, that might open up a spot for Ohio State to sneak into the top 4. There are also a lot of people advocating for Alabama to potentially sneak in as well. Well, with LSU falling outside of the top 5, Alabama is likely going to move to number 6 in the rankings this week. I get it, they're not going to be playing in the SEC title game, but a lot of people think that because their 2 losses were by a combined 4 points, they deserve a shot. Well, if we've never had a 2-loss team reach the college football playoff before, it's hard to imagine the first team being one that didn't even play in their conference title game. If anything, you would think that a team like USC would still get the edge over Alabama. But depending on what happens in that USC game, and maybe if they get blown up by Utah, then maybe you can make the case for Alabama. At the end of the day, when looking at the rankings, it really looks like if USC loses, it's only down to 3 teams. The Trojans not moving at all, Alabama somehow climbing inside the top 4, or Ohio State getting the benefit of the doubt as they only have 1 loss on the season, and they're the only team in that group of 3 that would have 1 loss. If I were to guess, I think Ohio State would be the team that would get the slight edge, just because like I mentioned, it's tough to see a 2-loss team getting in over a 1-loss team, regardless of whether or not they play in their conference championship game. But if USC were to lose a close game to Utah, like they did the first time around, losing by only 1 point, I still think there's a reality out there in which the Trojans stay in as a 2-loss team. So I do think it comes down to how USC looks in that game against Utah. But Ohio State is still hanging around, and like I mentioned, maybe the committee decides to knock out TCU if they lose by 2 scores or so to Kansas State next weekend. I don't think they should, but as we've seen with the College Football Playoff Committee, we can always expect the unexpected with them. But if I were to guess, I think the 4 favorites win out, and our College Football Playoff is Georgia, Michigan, TCU, and USC. I'm kind of bummed that LSU and Clemson lost this weekend because it would have added much more interest into conference championship weekend. Clemson still would have been alive, and LSU still would have been alive, making the top 4 that much more interesting. But based on how things look out, if the favorites win, then we're going to have our college football playoff set. So what are your thoughts on the uncertainty as we enter the final week of the college football season? Do you think TCU should be in whether or not they win or lose next weekend? And what are your thoughts on the 4th and final team if USC were to somehow lose to Utah? Do you think USC would stay at 4? Or do you think Ohio State or Alabama would leapfrog them and become the 4th and final team? Whatever your thoughts are on the final college football playoff rankings, let me know in the comment section down below. Before you leave, don't forget to smash that subscribe button and turn on those notifications if you're new to my channel. If you love college football, this is definitely the place for you. Like I mentioned earlier, I'm posting videos every day during the season, so make sure to subscribe if you call yourself a college football fan. Also, make sure to drop a like on this video as well. It helps out with that confusing YouTube algorithm and helps share the video with more college football fans. Plus, it only takes a second to do. As always, thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you all in my next video.